My husband's signature was already dry on the divorce papers. His suitcases stood by the front door like patient strangers waiting for a bus. 10 years of marriage, and we had become two people who passed each other in a hallway we used to call home. I thought I had made peace with the silence. I thought the ending had already been written. Then, 3 days before he was supposed to leave, I found a dusty VHS tape in a box marked "Wedding. Do not throw." And everything I thought I understood about us came apart in my hands. I want to tell you about the specific sound a legal document makes when you set it down on granite countertop. It's not dramatic. It's almost nothing. A soft slap of paper against stone, quieter than a hand landing on a table, quieter than a door closing. But I heard it every morning for 6 days, because that's how long the papers sat there before either of us touched them again. My name is Alina. I was 38 years old, and I was standing in the kitchen of a house I had chosen the paint colors for, the cabinet hardware for, the exact placement of the herb garden outside the window, and I was looking at a stack of paper that would end all of it with 2 signatures and a court date. Marcus had left them there on a Tuesday. He hadn't handed them to me. He hadn't sat me down. He had simply placed them on the counter next to the fruit bowl, the way you'd leave a reminder about picking up dry cleaning, and said, "I think we both know this is where we've landed." I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that, because so much of what I'm about to tell you only makes sense if you understand that by that point. I had already grieved this marriage in small installments, over years, in 100 quiet moments that never added up to a single dramatic scene. There was no affair. There was no betrayal in the way people usually mean it. There was just erosion, the kind that happens to a coastline, so slow you don't notice the land is disappearing until you're standing at the edge of a cliff that used to be 100 feet from the water. We had met when I was 26, at a friend's engagement party I almost didn't go to. Marcus was standing near the drinks table looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, which made me like him immediately, because I felt the same way. We talked for 3 hours. He told me he was terrified of birds, which I found absurd and endearing in equal measure. I told him I hated my job in marketing and dreamed of opening a small bakery someday, a dream I'd never said out loud to anyone else. He didn't laugh. He asked what kind of bread I'd make first. We were married 2 years later, in October, under a tent strung with lights that a sudden wind kept threatening to blow down. My father gave a toast that made everyone cry. Marcus's mother, who had never fully approved of me, hugged me at the end of the night and whispered that she was wrong about me, and I still think about that sometimes. For the first 4 years, we were, I think, genuinely happy. Not in a curated social media version of happy in the ordinary way, where you make coffee for each other without being asked, and you have private jokes that don't translate to anyone else. We bought the house in year 3. We talked about kids, and then quietly, mutually, decided not to, a decision I have never regretted and never will, though it became, later, one of the things people whispered about when they tried to explain why we failed. The shift didn't have a start date. If you had asked me, at the time, to point to the moment things began to change, I couldn't have. It was more like a temperature drop so gradual your body adjusts to it before your mind registers the cold. Conversations that used to run an hour started running 10 minutes. Weekend mornings that used to mean lying in bed, talking about nothing started meaning Marcus in his home office by 7 and me alone with coffee I didn't finish. By year 7, we had become excellent household managers and terrible partners. We split chores with the precision of 2 people running a business neither of us particularly wanted to be in. We discussed the mortgage refinance with more warmth than we discussed our actual lives. I remember sitting across from him at dinner one night, a nice dinner, something I'd actually cooked, not takeout, and realizing I had nothing to say to him that wasn't logistical. Did the plumber call back? Was his mother's flight confirmed? Had he remembered to move the recycling bins? I told myself this was simply what marriage became after a decade. I told myself every couple I knew had some version of this quiet flatline, and the ones who claimed otherwise were either lying or hadn't been married long enough yet to hit it. I told myself a lot of things, in those years, because the alternative was admitting that something precious was dying in a house I had picked the paint colors for. There's a term I heard once, on some daytime talk show I wasn't even really watching, and it lodged itself in me like a splinter I couldn't stop touching. The roommate phase. The host was describing exactly what Marcus and I had become, and I remember sitting on the couch, laundry basket on my hip, feeling suddenly and completely seen by a stranger on television. The roommate phase for us looked like this. We still lived in the same house. We still occasionally shared a bed, though increasingly one of us ended up on the pull-out couch in the office under the pretense of an early morning call. We still went to the same family gatherings and performed, competently, the choreography of a happy couple, his hand at the small of my back, my laugh at his jokes that had once been genuine and had become, by then, a kind of muscle memory. But at home, alone, we had stopped reaching for each other in almost every sense of the word. Not just physically, though that too, I won't pretend otherwise. We had stopped reaching for each other's opinions. I stopped telling him about the small humiliations of my day at work. He stopped telling me about the projects that used to make his eyes light up when he described them. We had, without ever discussing it, decided that the emotional labor of intimacy wasn't worth the return we were getting from each other anymore. I remember the specific weekend I understood how far we drifted. It was a Saturday in early spring, the kind of day that used to mean a long walk and stopping for coffee somewhere we'd never been. Instead, Marcus spent the morning reorganizing the garage, a task he does. I now understand. Whenever he is trying to manage anxiety he won't name out loud, and I spent it scrolling through old photos on my phone without really looking at any of them. Around noon, he came inside for water, and we stood in the kitchen together for maybe 90 seconds in total silence. Not an uncomfortable silence exactly, but not a comfortable one either. Just an absence. And then he went back outside, and I went back to my phone, and neither of us suggested we do anything together, because somewhere along the way we had both quietly concluded that suggesting it wasn't worth the risk of the other person saying no. That's the part nobody warns you about. Not the big betrayals, the affairs, the money problems, the screaming fights. The part nobody warns you about is the compounding effect of 1,000 small moments where you don't reach out, until reaching out starts to feel like a foreign language you used to be fluent in and have almost entirely forgotten. I started noticing the suitcases before either of us said the word divorce out loud. Marcus travels for work 3, sometimes 4 times a month, and I began to notice that he was gone more than he needed to be. A conference that could have been a video call. A client visit that could have waited a week. I didn't accuse him of anything because I didn't actually believe there was another woman. I still don't, and nothing in what follows changes that belief. I think, honestly, he was doing what I was doing in my own way, finding reasons to be somewhere the silence wasn't quite so loud. The actual conversation, when it finally happened, was almost anticlimactic. We were doing dishes, I washing, he drying, a division of labor we'd had for over a decade, and he said without any particular weight in his voice, "I don't think either of us is happy anymore." I dried my hands on the towel hanging from the oven door and said, "No, I don't think we are." And that was it. That was the whole conversation that ended a marriage. No raised voices, no accusations. Just 2 tired people, finally agreeing out loud on something they'd both known separately for a very long time. I want to be careful here, because I know how this can sound from the outside, like I'm describing a marriage that was cold and loveless from the start, and that isn't true. And it isn't fair to either of us. What I'm describing is something both more common and more painful than that. A marriage that was genuinely, deeply good for a long stretch of years, and then slowly stopped being fed, the way anything living stops thriving if you forget, again and again, in small ways to tend to it. In the weeks after that kitchen conversation, we operated with a strange, businesslike calm that I think surprised us both. We agreed, without lawyers yet involved, on the broad strokes. The house would likely be sold, the finances split according to what was fair, no children to complicate custody, no acrimony we could see on the horizon. Marcus, ever the planner, drew up a rough timeline. I remember thinking, almost with a kind of detached admiration, that we were probably better at ending our marriage with dignity than we had been, in recent years, at living inside it with any warmth. We told ourselves, both of us, that this was a mercy killing. That word came up more than once, from both our mouths, in those early days, The idea that we were putting an end to something that had already died, rather than destroying something that was still alive. It made the decision feel less like a failure and more like an act of honesty, even a kind of kindness. We had, after all, watched other couples we knew stay in marriages that had gone cold years past the point either party still wanted to be there, out of fear, or inertia, or the sheer exhaustion of imagining what came after. We told ourselves we were better than that. We were choosing truth over comfortable fiction. His suitcases went up by the front door on a Sunday. Not because he was leaving that day. The actual move-out date was still 2.5 weeks off, pending some logistics with his temporary apartment, but because, he said, packing a little at a time felt more manageable than doing it all at once. I understood that. I had started, in my own way, sorting through drawers and closets, making small, quiet piles of what would stay and what would eventually need dividing. It was during one of those sorting sessions that I found the box. It was in the back of our bedroom closet, on the highest shelf, behind a stack of winter coats we hadn't worn in 2 seasons because our winters had gotten milder, and neither of us had bothered giving the coats away. The box was cardboard, slightly crushed on one corner, and someone, I think it had been me, a decade earlier had written, "Wedding. Do not throw," across the top in permanent marker that had faded to a soft gray. I almost didn't open it. I want to be honest about that too. Some part of me, standing on the small step stool we kept for exactly this kind of closet archaeology, understood that opening a box of wedding memorabilia 3 weeks before my divorce was finalized was probably not a wise idea. Grief has a way of finding the sharpest object in any room and walking straight toward it. But curiosity, or maybe something more specific than curiosity, some instinct I didn't examine closely enough at the time, won out, and I brought the box down and set it on the bed and opened it. Inside was what you'd expect, a folded, yellowing program from the ceremony, a small bundle of cards people had left at the reception, still in their opened envelopes, a single dried flower from my bouquet, pressed flat between 2 pieces of wax paper I must have put there myself, though I had no memory of doing it. And at the bottom, wrapped in a scarf I recognized as one my grandmother used to wear, a VHS tape. I sat back on my heels and stared at it for a long moment before I understood what I was looking at. My cousin Danny, the family's self-appointed videographer for every event for about 15 years, before everyone switched to phones, had recorded our wedding on an old camcorder, and at some point, someone had transferred it, or tried to, onto this single unmarked VHS tape. I hadn't thought about that tape in probably 8 years. I wasn't even entirely sure it still played anything at all. I sat there on the bedroom floor, tape in my hands, the closet door open behind me, winter coats we no longer needed hanging above me, and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in a very long time. The specific, dangerous pull of wanting to know what a version of yourself from 10 years ago had actually looked like, saying words you could no longer fully remember meaning. The problem, of course, was that we no longer owned a VHS player. Nobody does. They had gone the way of answering machines and phone books, useful relics that quietly vanish from a household the moment you stop noticing you're not replacing them. I stood in the bedroom holding a tape I suddenly, urgently wanted to watch, with absolutely no way to watch it. I thought about throwing it away. I want to admit that, because I think it's an honest and human impulse, and because it tells you something about where my head was in that moment. Some small, protective part of me understood that whatever was on that tape had the potential to either comfort me or completely dismantle whatever fragile equilibrium I had built around the idea of this divorce being the right, mature, mutually agreed-upon choice. It would have been easier, in some ways, to let the tape stay exactly what it had been for the past 8 years, an unexamined artifact gathering dust in a box marked, "Do not throw," which is its own kind of quiet lie we tell ourselves, the difference between not throwing something away and actually being willing to look at it. But I didn't throw it away. Instead, I did something almost comically mundane, given the emotional weight the tape had suddenly taken on in my chest. I searched online for anywhere nearby that still converted VHS to digital. There was a small, cluttered shop about 20 minutes from our house, the kind of place that also fixed vacuum cleaners and sold second-hand cameras, run by a man named Harold who looked to be somewhere in his 70s, and who took the tape from me with the gentle, unhurried care of someone handling something he understood mattered, even without being told why. "Give me 2 days," he said. "I'll put it on a drive for you, easier than a disc these days." I didn't tell Marcus about the tape. I want to be honest about that decision too, because I've thought about it a great deal since, turning it over from every angle, trying to understand my own motives. Part of it was practical. He was consumed those days with apartment logistics and moving quotes, and mentioning an old wedding tape in the middle of that seemed almost cruel, an unnecessary complication dropped into an already difficult process. But part of it, the part I'm less proud of and more honest about, was that I wasn't sure yet what I wanted to do with whatever I found on that tape, and I wasn't ready to have that decision taken out of my hands by his reaction, whatever that reaction might be. The 2 days Harold asked for felt like considerably more than 2 days. I went about the business of dividing a marriage, a phone call with a real estate agent about listing the house, an afternoon separating which books on the shelf were mine, and which had been his, a strange, hollow hour spent deciding who would keep the good set of kitchen knives we had received as a wedding gift from an aunt who had since passed away. Every one of these small tasks felt like removing a single thread from a piece of fabric, and I kept waiting for the moment the whole thing would visibly begin to unravel, and it never quite did, which was its own kind of disorienting. We were, it turned out, extremely competent at ending things. Marcus, for his part, seemed lighter in those days, in a way that unsettled me more than sadness would have. Not happy, exactly. I don't want to suggest he was celebrating, but unburdened, the way a person looks after finally setting down a heavy bag they've been carrying so long they'd forgotten it was optional. I remember watching him actually whistle, while loading boxes into his car one afternoon, and feeling something sharp and unnamed move through my chest, something that wasn't quite jealousy and wasn't quite grief but sat somewhere in the overlap between the two. When Harold called to say the drive was ready, I told him I'd come by that afternoon, and I sat in the parking lot of his cluttered little shop for almost 10 minutes before I went inside, trying to prepare myself for something I had no real way of preparing for, because I didn't yet know what it was. "Good stuff on there," Harold said, handing me a small USB drive in a paper bag, as though he'd watched at least some of it himself, which, judging by the look on his face, he probably had. "You looked so young." I drove home with the drive sitting on the passenger seat like it was something that might shift or spill if I took a turn too fast, and that evening, with Marcus at his temporary apartment for a walkthrough, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the same table where those divorce papers had first landed, and plugged the drive into my laptop, and pressed play on a version of my own wedding I hadn't seen in a decade, with absolutely no idea that what I was about to watch would force both of us to reckon with exactly what we were about to throw away. The footage was shaky at first. Danny had never been a steady hand with a camera, and the first 20 seconds were mostly ceiling and the blurred edge of a tent pole before he found his footing and the frame settled on the aisle. I almost laughed out loud, alone in that kitchen, at the sight of my father's shoes, which I'd forgotten were slightly too big for him that day because he'd borrowed them from his brother at the last minute when his own dress shoes turned up missing. And then the camera found me. I want to describe what it did to me, seeing that. Not the dress, though the dress mattered too plain and a little too heavy for October, a decision my 26-year-old self had made with more romanticism than practicality. What undid me was my face. I looked, if I'm honest, terrified and radiant in exactly equal measure, an expression I don't think I have made since, an expression that belongs entirely to people who haven't yet learned what disappointment costs. I was looking at Marcus at the end of that aisle like he was the answer to a question I hadn't known I was asking. The vows themselves I had genuinely forgotten. Not the general shape of them, I remembered we'd written our own, remembered the broad strokes of what we'd promised, but the specific language had eroded out of my memory, the way most specific language does, worn smooth by a decade of living instead of remembering. Hearing Marcus's voice, 29 years old and cracking slightly with an emotion he rarely let himself show even then, saying words he'd apparently written and revised and rewritten, undid something in my chest I hadn't given permission to be undone. He talked about being afraid of birds, an old joke between us by then, referencing that first conversation at the engagement party, and said that meeting me had taught him that being afraid of something didn't mean you couldn't also decide to stand still in front of it and let it land on your hand anyway. He said marriage terrified him for the same reason birds did. Something with a mind entirely its own, landing on you and trusting you not to close your fist around it. He promised, in front of 40 or so people under a tent the wind kept threatening to take apart, that he would spend his life learning the specific ways I needed to be loved, rather than assuming the ways he already knew. I sat at that kitchen table and I cried, not delicately, not the composed, camera-ready crying I associate with grief in movies, but the ugly, shoulder-shaking kind that comes from somewhere older than the immediate cause. Because here was the truth the tape had just handed me, unasked for and undeniable. The man who had made that promise and the man who had left divorce papers by the fruit bowl were not different men. They were the same man, a decade older, who had simply stopped doing the specific, deliberate work of learning the ways I needed to be loved. And if I was honest with myself, sitting there with mascara running down my face onto a laptop keyboard, I had stopped doing the same work in return. We hadn't failed each other through malice. We had failed each other through neglect, the ordinary, unremarkable neglect of two people who assumed love, once established, would simply maintain itself without further tending. I watched the whole tape twice. The second time, I paid closer attention to something I'd nearly missed the first time through, a moment near the end of the reception, unscripted, clearly not meant to be a moment at all, where Marcus and I were dancing to something slow and a little off-key from the band, and he leaned down and said something to me that the microphone barely caught, muffled by the music and the crowd noise. I rewound it 4 times before I was certain of what he'd said. "Whatever we become," he murmured against my temple, "promise me we'll become it together, not just next to each other." I sat with that sentence for a long time, because I understood now with a clarity that felt almost violent in its suddenness, precisely what had happened to us. We had not become anything together in those last several years. We had become 2 separate things, quietly, politely, existing next to each other in the same house, sharing a mortgage and a whistling contentment at the prospect of finally not having to keep failing at something neither of us had the energy to name. If you've ever found an old photo or recording that suddenly made you see your own life differently, comment, the tape, below and tell us what it was. I want to know I'm not the only one this has happened to. I didn't call Marcus that night. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next. It would have been easy, dramatically easy, the kind of thing that happens in the movies, to call him immediately, breathless, and say, "Watch this. Remember this. Don't you remember who we were?" But some instinct, quieter and more stubborn than my grief, told me that a decade of erosion doesn't get repaired by a single tearful phone call built on nostalgia. If anything, I suspected that kind of call would only embarrass us both, would feel like using an old, fragile version of ourselves to guilt the current, tired versions into something neither of us had actually decided we wanted. So instead, I did something slower. Over the following several days, I found myself thinking not about the wedding itself, but about that specific sentence. Become it together, not just next to each other, turning it over, examining it from every angle, trying to understand honestly whether what I wanted was to save the marriage, or whether what I wanted was simply to understand, for my own peace, exactly where and how we had lost the thread. I want to tell you that I reached some grand, cinematic clarity in those days. I didn't. What I reached instead was smaller and, I think now, more useful. A willingness to ask Marcus one honest question before either of us signed anything. I asked him to meet me for coffee, neutral ground, not the house, not his temporary apartment, at a small place near his office we used to go to years earlier, before it became easier to just make coffee at home and not leave at all. He looked wary when he sat down, and I understood why. Neutral ground coffee meetings, 3 weeks before a divorce, rarely mean nothing. "I found the wedding tape," I told him. No preamble. I'd decided in the days leading up to that morning that there had been enough preamble in our marriage's final years. Enough softened, indirect, hedged language designed to avoid saying the actual thing. Something moved across his face, fast, like weather. I didn't know we still had that. Cousin Danny's version. I got it transferred. I slid my phone across the table, cued to the moment near the end of the reception, the muffled, half-caught sentence. I watched him watch it. I watched his jaw tighten in the specific way it does when he's trying not to show that something has landed. "Whatever we become," he said quietly when it finished, not looking at me, looking at the table. "Promise me we'll become it together." "Not just next to each other," I finished. "That's what we did, though, ended up next to each other." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, someone's dog was tied to a bike rack, patient and unbothered, and I remember focusing on it because I needed somewhere to put my eyes that wasn't his face. "I don't think either of us did anything wrong," he finally said. "I've thought about that a lot the last few weeks. It's not like there's a villain in this." "No," I agreed. "There isn't. I think that's almost worse somehow. It would almost be easier to divide up blame." "I'm not asking you to stop the divorce," I told him, and I meant it in that moment as much as I've ever meant anything. I don't actually know if that's what I want. I genuinely don't. But I watched that tape, and I realized we never actually asked each other the real question. We asked logistics questions. We asked who keeps the good knives and when the house goes on the market. We never once, in all these weeks, asked each other whether the reason we stopped becoming things together was because we didn't want to anymore, or because we forgot it required ongoing effort, and just let the forgetting run its course. Marcus turned his coffee cup slowly on its saucer. A habit of his I'd forgotten I found endearing, back when I still noticed things like that about him. "I don't know the answer to that either," he said, finally. "I think I convinced myself somewhere along the way that if it required that much effort, it must not be real anymore. That real love was supposed to get easier, not harder. And ours kept getting harder, and I read that as a verdict instead of just a season." "I did the same thing," I admitted. "I stopped reaching out because reaching out and getting silence back felt worse than not reaching out at all. And I never told you that's what was happening. I just quietly stopped and let you think I'd stopped caring, when really I just stopped believing it would be received." We didn't resolve anything at that coffee shop. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story people expect, where one tape and one conversation dissolves a decade of accumulated silence, and that version would be a lie. What we did instead was agree to pause, not cancel, not reverse, just pause the paperwork that was already moving through the system, and to spend 30 days actually doing the specific, unglamorous work neither of us had done in years. Talking, actually talking, without an agenda of logistics attached to it. I won't pretend those 30 days were easy or romantic in the way the wedding tape had briefly, dangerously made me imagine they might be. Real repair rarely looks like a movie. It looked, mostly, like awkward dinners where we tried to talk about things other than the mortgage and kept lapsing into silence out of a decade of habit, catching ourselves and trying again. It looked like Marcus telling me, for the first time in years, about a project at work that genuinely excited him, and me having to consciously remember how to ask a follow-up question instead of simply saying, "That's nice," and changing the subject. It looked like me telling him about the bakery dream I'd once mentioned at that engagement party and had quietly buried under 15 years of a marketing career, and watching him get genuinely, unexpectedly animated about the idea, asking questions I hadn't expected him to care about anymore. We saw a counselor twice during those 30 days, not out of desperation, but because we both recognized, independently, that we didn't fully trust our own judgment on this, given how badly we'd both misread the silence for over a year. The counselor, a calm woman named Priya with a gift for asking exactly the uncomfortable question we'd both been avoiding, said something in our second session that I've carried since. "You didn't fall out of love. You fell out of practice." Those are different diagnoses, and they have different treatments. By the end of those 30 days, we hadn't torn up the divorce papers in some grand romantic gesture. Life doesn't usually offer you that kind of clean theater. What we had instead was a quieter, more honest decision, to withdraw the filing together and commit to something we both understood would require ongoing, unglamorous, daily effort. Not because a tape had magically fixed us, but because the tape had shown us, undeniably, what we were choosing to walk away from without ever having properly examined it. It's been just over 2 years since that afternoon in Harold's cluttered shop. I still have the drive. I still, occasionally, watch a few seconds of it, though I no longer need it the way I did that first raw night at the kitchen table. Marcus and I are not the same couple who nearly signed those papers. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to pretend the marriage became effortless, some fairy tale where a single VHS tape cured a decade of erosion. It didn't. What changed, specifically, is that we stopped assuming love would maintain itself, and started treating it the way you'd treat anything else you actually wanted to keep alive. With attention, with regular tending, with the humility to say out loud when we felt the silence creeping back in, instead of waiting for it to compound into something we'd have to excavate later from the back of a closet. I did open that bakery, in a small way, a Saturday stall at the farmer's market first, which has since become talk of an actual storefront. Marcus comes every Saturday morning, without fail, and tells strangers browsing the sourdough that his wife makes the best bread in the county, which is an exaggeration, but I let him have it. I think often about that box marked "Wedding, do not throw," sitting for 8 years on a shelf behind winter coats we no longer needed. I think about how close I came to letting it stay there, unopened, an artifact of a version of us that had nothing left to teach the present. And I think about Harold, handing me that little paper bag, telling me I looked so young, as if he understood, better than I did in that moment, that what I was about to watch wasn't really about the past at all. It was a question about the future, disguised as an old recording. Whatever we become, will we become it together or just next to each other? I don't think either of us can promise a marriage will last simply by wanting it to. But I do believe now that most marriages don't die from a single betrayal. They die from 1,000 small moments where two people quietly decide the silence is easier than the reaching. We chose, in the end, to keep reaching. Some days it's still hard. Most days now it isn't. And that, I've come to believe, is the entire difference between becoming something together and merely existing next to it.